The most dangerous part isn't the trauma. The most dangerous part isn't the betrayal. It isn't the abandonment. It isn't even the years spent carrying wounds that nobody could see. People think the worst thing is what happened to them, but they are wrong. The true horror begins when a human being absorbs so much pain, so much disappointment, so much emotional poison, that something inside them quietly mutates into something entirely different. Not weaker, not broken, different. Because there exists a rare type of person who doesn't react to suffering the way most people do. They internalize it, study it, survive it, and then one day, without warning, they emerge from it transformed. These are the trauma-born empath loners, and only a tiny fraction ever survive the psychological journey that creates them. Most collapse under the weight. Most lose themselves completely. Most spend their lives repeating the same painful cycles. But the few who make it through become almost impossible to manipulate, impossible to control, impossible to break, because the very thing that nearly destroyed them eventually becomes the source of their power. If you've ever felt different, if you've ever felt like life forced you to grow up too fast, if you've spent years carrying invisible burdens while everyone assumed you were fine, then what you're about to hear may explain something you've felt your entire life but never had words for. Stay with me because what happens next changes everything. Chase Hughes discovered something unsettling about human psychology. The traits we suppress do not disappear. They wait, they hide. They gather strength in the shadows of the unconscious mind. And according to Jungian psychology, every ignored emotion eventually demands to be seen. Every abandoned part of the self eventually returns. Carl Jung called this process compensation. The psyche seeks equilibrium. It refuses to remain fragmented forever. And Hughes understood something terrifying. When a person spends years sacrificing themselves for others, they aren't eliminating parts of themselves. They're burying them alive. The anger, the boundaries, the self-protection, the instinct to say no, the instinct to walk away, all of it gets pushed deeper underground. And the deeper it goes, the stronger it becomes. This is why trauma-born empaths often confuse people. From the outside, they appear gentle, understanding, patient, forgiving. But beneath the surface, a storm is forming, a pressure system building silently behind emotional walls, a psychological volcano preparing for an eruption nobody sees coming. The story usually begins the same way. A child learns that love must be earned, peace must be maintained, conflict must be avoided. The emotions of others become more important than their own, so they adapt. They become emotional caretakers, human shock absorbers, living sponges for the pain of everyone around them. When someone is angry, they calm them. When someone is hurting, they rescue them. When someone is broken, they fix them. And slowly, almost invisibly, they begin abandoning themselves. Not because they want to, because they believe survival depends on it. They become experts at reading rooms, experts at detecting tension, experts at anticipating emotional danger. Their nervous system becomes a radar station scanning constantly for threats. Every facial expression becomes data. Every change in tone becomes a warning signal. Every silence becomes something to decode. And while everyone else is living life, they are managing emotional weather patterns, day after day, year after year. Imagine pouring water into a well with no bottom. Imagine spending decades giving pieces of yourself away only to discover the emptiness never gets filled. That is what many trauma-born empaths experience. They become bridges for people who never intended to cross safely. They become homes for people who never planned to stay. They become lifeboats for people who keep drilling holes in the boat. And somehow they continue giving, continue forgiving, continue hoping, even as exhaustion begins consuming them from the inside. What makes this suffering particularly cruel is that it often goes unnoticed. The empath smiles, shows up, keeps functioning, keeps carrying everyone else, while privately feeling like they're disappearing, like their identity is dissolving beneath endless emotional obligations, like they're becoming a ghost inside their own life. Jung described this as self-abandonment, a dangerous psychological imbalance where the authentic self becomes sacrificed for approval, attachment, and survival. And the longer this continues, the more fragile the internal structure becomes, like a rubber band stretched beyond its intended limits. At first it expands, then it strains, then tiny fractures begin forming, invisible, silent, but inevitable. Most people assume the breaking point looks dramatic, screaming, crying, confrontation, explosive emotion. But that's not what happens. The real transformation is far more unsettling. Because when trauma-born empath loners finally reach their limit, there is no explosion, there is only silence, a strange silence, a terrifying silence, a silence that changes everything. It happens in an ordinary moment. No warning, no ceremony, no grand declaration, just a single realization, a realization so profound that the mind can never return to what it was before. The receiver shuts off. The signal disappears. The bridge collapses without making a sound. And suddenly they see everything. Every manipulation, every betrayal, every one-sided sacrifice, every excuse they made for people who never deserved it, every piece of themselves they abandoned trying to save others, and in that moment, something clicks. Not emotionally, psychologically. A lock turns, a door seals, a chapter ends. Forever. What makes this moment so chilling is how calm it feels. No rage, no hatred, no revenge, just clarity. Cold, undeniable clarity. The kind of clarity that arrives after surviving years of confusion. Imagine standing in a house that's been on fire for decades, smoke everywhere, visibility gone, breathing impossible. Then suddenly, the smoke clears, the fire goes out, and for the first time you see the damage exactly as it is. That's what happens. The illusion shatters, the spell breaks, and once seen, it cannot be unseen. This is where Hughes believed many people misunderstand transformation. Observers think the empath has become cold, detached, heartless. But the truth is something entirely different. The trauma-born empath isn't becoming less human. They're becoming whole. This is shadow integration, one of Jung's most powerful psychological concepts, the return of everything that was suppressed, the return of healthy aggression, the return of self-protection, the return of boundaries, the return of personal authority. The parts they feared become the parts that save them. The traits they buried become the foundation of their survival. Because the shadow was never the enemy. The shadow contained the strength they abandoned. And now it returns, not as destruction, as liberation. Imagine a fortress that spent years leaving its gates open, welcoming everyone, trusting everyone, protecting everyone, while invaders entered freely, taking whatever they wanted. Then one day the gates close, the walls rise, the guards awaken, not because the fortress became cruel, because it finally learned its value. That is what begins happening inside the trauma-born empath. Something ancient awakens, something powerful, something that was waiting beneath years of self-sacrifice. And for the first time in their life, they stop asking for permission to exist. For years they had mistaken endurance for love. They believed loyalty meant staying. They believed compassion meant tolerating. They believed understanding someone's wounds meant accepting the damage those wounds caused. But now something entirely different begins to emerge. Not cruelty, not bitterness, discernment. And that distinction changes everything, because the trauma-born empath loner reaches a stage most people never understand. A stage where they stop confusing empathy with self-destruction, where they stop volunteering as emotional collateral for the chaos of others, where they finally recognize a truth so powerful it feels almost forbidden. Not everyone deserves unlimited access to your heart. The realization arrives like dawn after a lifetime of darkness, quiet, gradual, yet impossible to stop. And as this awareness spreads through their psyche, the old version of themselves begins to dissolve. The people pleaser, the rescuer, the emotional caretaker, the one who kept apologizing for wounds they never caused, the one who carried guilt that never belonged to them, the one who stayed long after respect had already left the room. That identity begins falling away, not violently, naturally, like a snake shedding skin that no longer fits. And for the first time, they begin meeting themselves, the real self, the abandoned self, the forgotten self hidden beneath years of emotional labor. According to Jungian psychology, this is the beginning of individuation, the process of becoming psychologically whole, the process of reclaiming every fragmented piece of identity scattered throughout years of adaptation and survival. Hughes often emphasized that suppressed traits never remain dormant forever. Eventually, they return. And when they return after decades of neglect, they do not come back weak. They come back demanding recognition, demanding integration, demanding balance. This is why the transformation feels so overwhelming. Because the trauma-born empath isn't simply learning new behaviors. They are reconnecting with ancient instincts, instincts they were forced to abandon. The instinct to protect themselves, the instinct to walk away, the instinct to recognize danger, the instinct to place their own well-being on equal footing with everyone else's. For someone who spent years sacrificing themselves, this feels almost revolutionary, like discovering a hidden room inside a house they've lived in their entire life, a room filled with forgotten treasures, forgotten strengths, forgotten truths, forgotten power. And the deeper they enter this room, the more they realize how much of themselves was never truly lost. It was merely waiting, waiting beneath the wreckage, waiting beneath the guilt, waiting beneath the fear, waiting beneath the endless pressure to become what everyone else needed. Now imagine a leash snapping after years of tension, not with explosive force, but with finality. The pressure disappears instantly, the weight vanishes, the pull is gone. That is what emotional freedom feels like for the trauma-born empath, a sudden absence of chains they didn't even realize they were carrying. And this is where everything becomes fascinating, because the people around them begin noticing the change long before they understand it. Friends notice, family notices, partners notice, manipulators notice, especially manipulators, because manipulation depends on access, it depends on emotional openings, it depends on predictable responses. It depends on guilt, fear, obligation, hope. The manipulator survives by pulling invisible strings. But something extraordinary happens when the empath completes shadow integration. The strings disappear, and suddenly the puppeteer is left holding empty air. The guilt trips stop working. The emotional blackmail stops working. The carefully crafted victim stories stop working. The manufactured crises stop working, the false promises stop working, because the emotional hooks have nowhere to attach. It's like throwing an anchor into empty sky. There is nothing left to catch, nothing left to control, and the manipulator feels it immediately, though they often cannot understand what they're experiencing. At first they become confused. The old strategies no longer produce familiar reactions. The empath doesn't argue, doesn't defend, doesn't explain, doesn't chase, doesn't panic. The response they expected never arrives. The emotional supply line has been severed, like a radio transmitter suddenly going dark. No signal, no feedback, no access, just silence. A silence more terrifying than any confrontation, because confrontation still creates connection. Silence creates uncertainty, and uncertainty terrifies those who rely on control. So they try harder. They escalate. The love bombing begins. Unexpected kindness, sudden affection, promises of change, grand emotional gestures, words carefully chosen to reopen old wounds and trigger old hopes. But something has changed. The empath sees through it, not because they became cynical, because they became aware. The illusion that once felt magical now feels mechanical, predictable, transparent, like seeing the wires behind a stage performance. The trick no longer works once you understand how it's done. And this is often the moment manipulators experience their greatest fear, not rejection, irrelevance, because control requires emotional investment. The moment the empath stops investing emotionally, the entire structure begins collapsing. Imagine a parasite discovering the host has become immune. Imagine a fisherman casting bait into water where no fish remain. Imagine a locksmith standing before a door whose locks have been permanently changed. That is what this experience feels like from the manipulator's perspective. The old pathways are gone. The familiar entrances are sealed. The house has finally been secured. And the most haunting part? The empath often achieves this without speaking a single word. No dramatic speech, no revenge, no public exposure, no attempt to win. They simply stop participating. They stop volunteering their energy. They stop feeding dysfunction. They stop carrying responsibilities that were never theirs. And suddenly, the entire psychological ecosystem shifts, because many toxic relationships survive on one hidden agreement. One person gives, the other takes. One person absorbs, the other unloads. One person sacrifices, the other benefits. But when the empath withdraws from this agreement, the system can no longer sustain itself. The machine grinds to a halt. The illusion collapses. The emotional economy crashes. And for the first time, the manipulator is forced to face a reality they spent years avoiding. They were never powerful. They were dependent, dependent on access, dependent on compliance, dependent on emotional availability, dependent on someone else's willingness to remain trapped. Now that willingness is gone forever. This creates one of the strangest psychological reversals imaginable. The person once viewed as weak becomes untouchable. The person once viewed as vulnerable becomes resilient. The person once viewed as controllable becomes impossible to predict, not because they changed who they are, because they stopped betraying who they are. And that distinction is everything. This is where psychological compensation reaches its peak. The psyche begins restoring balance. Years of self-abandonment are countered by self-respect. Years of confusion are replaced by clarity. Years of emotional chaos are replaced by order. Years of external validation are replaced by internal certainty. The pendulum swings back toward equilibrium, toward sovereignty, toward wholeness, toward freedom. For the trauma-born empath loner, this phase often feels surreal, almost dreamlike, because they discover something unexpected. Peace. Not excitement, not victory. Peace. A stillness they have never experienced before. A silence that no longer feels lonely. A solitude that no longer feels empty. A life no longer organized around the moods, needs, and demands of others. The nervous system finally begins relaxing. The hypervigilance fades. The constant scanning for danger slows. The emotional alarm system quiets. And beneath the noise they carried for years, something beautiful emerges. A self they have never truly met. A self untouched by manipulation. A self untouched by fear. A self untouched by performance. A self that existed long before trauma taught them to survive. And that self is waiting. Waiting beneath the ashes. Waiting beneath the scars. Waiting beneath the ruins of every false identity they were forced to wear. Like a phoenix hidden inside a burning forest. Like gold buried beneath collapsed stone. Like a lighthouse surviving a century of storms. The real transformation is only beginning, because what emerges next is even more powerful than healing. It is immunity. Psychological immunity, the kind only suffering can create. Psychological immunity is not what most people think it is. It is not becoming emotionless. It is not refusing to trust. It is not building walls so high that nobody can enter. The wounded often believe strength means becoming untouchable, but true strength is something far more sophisticated, something far more rare. It is the ability to remain open without becoming vulnerable to exploitation, the ability to remain compassionate without becoming responsible for everyone else's suffering, the ability to love without abandoning yourself. And for the trauma-born empath loner, reaching this stage feels almost supernatural. Because for most of their life, pain was a teacher they never asked for, a relentless instructor that arrived without invitation. Every betrayal taught vigilance. Every disappointment taught discernment. Every abandonment taught resilience. Every heartbreak carved deeper psychological understanding into the architecture of their mind. At the time, none of it felt meaningful. It felt unfair, cruel, pointless. But now, standing on the other side of those experiences, a hidden pattern begins to reveal itself. The suffering was never creating weakness. It was creating vision, the kind of vision that sees beyond words, beyond appearances, beyond performance. They begin noticing what others miss, the contradiction between language and behavior, the gap between promises and actions, the subtle signs of manipulation hidden beneath charm, the silent motives concealed behind masks. Not because they are suspicious, because they are awake. Years spent surviving emotional chaos sharpened their perception. What once felt like a curse becomes a gift forged in darkness. Imagine standing atop a mountain during a storm. For years, the clouds prevented you from seeing the landscape below. Lightning blinded you. Rain overwhelmed you. Wind pushed you to your limits. Then suddenly, the storm ends. The clouds part. And for the first time, you see everything clearly: the roads, the valleys, the dangers, the possibilities. Nothing changed except your perspective. That is the birth of psychological clarity. And clarity changes everything, because clarity eliminates confusion. Confusion is the oxygen of manipulation. Confusion keeps people trapped. Confusion keeps people second-guessing themselves. Confusion keeps people explaining away what they already know is wrong, but clarity cuts through illusion like a blade. Once clarity arrives, the mind can no longer be easily deceived. The trauma-born empath begins trusting something they ignored for years: their own perception, their own instincts, their own truth. This is the emergence of sovereignty of self, a concept deeply connected to Jung's process of individuation. The realization that your value does not depend on approval, your identity does not depend on acceptance, your worth does not depend on being chosen. For years they searched for permission: permission to rest, permission to leave, permission to have boundaries, permission to say no, permission to matter. Now they understand something profound. Permission was never required, because sovereignty is not granted, it is claimed. And once claimed, it transforms everything. The trauma-born empath no longer enters rooms hoping to be understood. They enter rooms understanding themselves. They no longer negotiate their value. They embody it. They no longer shrink to make others comfortable. They occupy their space naturally, like a mountain no longer apologizing for its size, like the ocean no longer apologizing for its depth, like the sun no longer apologizing for shining. This is why people often describe their transformation as intimidating. Not because they became aggressive, because they became certain. And certainty unsettles those who benefited from uncertainty. The person who once questioned every decision now trusts themselves. The person who once sought endless reassurance now relies on inner guidance. The person who once chased closure now creates it. And perhaps the most remarkable change of all, they stop explaining. This is the stage where many observers become confused. They expect arguments, defenses, justifications, emotional reactions. But none arrive. Because the trauma-born empath has discovered something liberating. Not everyone deserves an explanation. Not everyone deserves access. Not everyone deserves another chance. And most importantly, not everyone deserves your energy. Imagine a fortress whose walls were finally completed. Not walls built from fear. Walls built from wisdom. The gates still open. But only for those who arrive with respect. Only for those who arrive with integrity. Only for those who understand reciprocity. The fortress is no longer vulnerable, yet it remains alive. That is healthy detachment. That is psychological maturity. That is freedom. And then comes the final evolution. The stage most people misunderstand completely: indifference. The word itself sounds cold. But true indifference is not coldness, it is transcendence. Hatred still requires attachment. Anger still requires attachment. Resentment still requires attachment. Revenge still requires attachment. But indifference? Indifference asks for nothing, demands nothing, needs nothing. It is the absence of emotional dependency, the absence of psychological captivity, the absence of unfinished battles. The trauma-born empath eventually reaches a place where they stop hoping toxic people will change, not because change is impossible, because it is no longer their responsibility. They stop waiting for apologies, stop waiting for accountability, stop waiting for understanding, stop waiting for justice, not because those things lack value, because their peace no longer depends on them. And this realization feels like stepping out of a prison cell whose door was never actually locked. The chains fall away, the burden disappears, the waiting ends. For years they believed freedom would arrive when someone finally understood their pain. Now they understand freedom arrives when understanding is no longer required. That is wisdom. That is liberation. That is transcendence. The manipulator can no longer reach them, not because distance was created, because dependency was removed. The guilt finds no target. The hooks find no attachment. The games find no participant. The signal finds no receiver, like an old radio broadcasting into empty space. The noise continues, but nobody is listening, and in that silence, something extraordinary happens. Life begins again, not the life they were surviving, the life they were meant to live, a life built on truth instead of fear, a life built on authenticity instead of performance, a life built on choice instead of obligation. For the first time, they experience relationships that do not require self-sacrifice, conversations that do not require self-betrayal, love that does not require self-abandonment, and perhaps the greatest surprise of all, they discover they were never too sensitive, never too emotional, never too difficult. They were simply surrounded by people who benefited from their lack of boundaries. The problem was never their capacity to love. The problem was where that love was being invested. And once that realization arrives, there is no going back. The old identity fades into memory. The wounded rescuer disappears. The exhausted caretaker dissolves. The abandoned self returns home, whole, integrated, awake, free. This is what only a small percentage truly achieve. Not survival, transformation, not endurance, evolution, not recovery, rebirth. Because the trauma-born empath loner who survives the fire does not emerge as the same person. They emerge as someone entirely new, someone who has walked through psychological darkness and carried back wisdom, someone who has faced their shadow and found strength waiting there, someone who no longer fears abandonment because they finally stopped abandoning themselves. And that may be the most important truth of all. The people who hurt them thought they were taking everything. They thought they were winning. They thought they were leaving scars. But hidden inside every wound was a doorway. Hidden inside every betrayal was a lesson. Hidden inside every ending was an awakening. The trauma-born empath was never being destroyed. They were being revealed. The silence you hear now is not emptiness. It is not loneliness. It is not defeat. It is the sound of chains breaking in the distance. It is the sound of illusions collapsing. It is the sound of a soul returning to itself, because they are no longer waiting to be understood, no longer waiting to be chosen, no longer waiting to be saved. They have already found what they were searching for, themselves. And in the end, that was the one thing nobody could ever take away. They were never losing the world. They were finding their own. They were never becoming cold. They were becoming complete. And the silence that remains is not the silence of absence. It is the silence of a soul that has finally come home.